Good morning, church family. So I'm looking for some kids. There's some kids out there. I see some. I'm not talking about you, Gerald. If the kids want to come up to the front, I can dismiss them to class. Hey, good morning. Okay. Well, I can come down here and join you guys. Oh, here they come. Here they come. Okay. Let me pray for you guys, and then you can head off to class. All right? Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you so much for the gift of children. And Lord, we thank you also for the responsibility to be faithful to them as parents and as people that are examples to them. Lord, I pray that they would see Jesus living in us as they go and live their lives. So God, be with them this morning as they go to Sunday school, and may their minds and hearts be open to the good news of Jesus. And we pray all of this in your name. Amen. Okay, you guys can go. You know, it's always fun having kids. They say the most unexpected things at times, and it's a great encouragement. Happy Mother's Day to all of our moms. I hope that everyone has said something to their significant other today, encouraging them and telling them how wonderful they are and all of those wonderful things. Look at that. Yes, the men are leaning over now and saying, yes, oh yes, I'm saying that now. Okay. All right. Well, it's a wonder. Women are awesome, by the way, because yes, thank you for, okay, okay, it's a little bit delayed there, but it's coming, okay? So, today we're going to look at some awesome women in the scriptures, okay? And, their names are Ruth and Naomi, and we're going to look at the book of Ruth and learn some lessons from them about faith. Because a lot of the time, and let me just talk to the men for a minute. Some of the time, women are much better at faith than us guys are. As men, we're very tangible. We want something. If we can hold it, if we can touch it, we do well with that. And we don't necessarily do well with something that we can't see in this element of faith. But ladies have this amazing gift where they get faith. They understand faith. And so today we're going to look at Ruth and Naomi because they are examples for us about what actually faith can look like. Now it doesn't mean, let me clarify this right off the point, it doesn't mean that faith is easy. But what it does mean is that we can, if we're looking, see God every day. And looking for proof of God at work in and around us every day. Like, we don't necessarily have this mundane routine to our life. Now, if we do, maybe, just maybe, we're not seeing God and proof of the divine around us. But why we need these lessons is because we need our faith built up, where our confidence in God grows. And that's really why, one of the reasons why we gather on Sundays. We gather like this in groups. We gather like this on a Sunday to encourage one another, to sort of get a different perspective of things that are happening around us. And we see that so much when we actually see God in our everyday lives. So we're going to look at the book of Ruth this morning. We're not going to look at the verse by verse. We're just going to look at the book of Ruth generally speaking, and I'm going to paraphrase it for you as we get going this morning so you kind of know some things, and then we're going to drill down into the life of Ruth and Naomi and get some principles out of there. Now, the book of Ruth involves the story of a family's journey. And that's real important to notice because if you have a family, you have a journey. And when you look back over your life, you can see how God has been moving over time. And the context of this is there's this family that lives in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is this place that's really just a village at this time. So this is long before King David. This is during the time of the judges. And so this is just after the nation of Israel comes in and conquers the land. And there's some people wandering around. They don't have a king yet. They have just judges. So this is before the time period of King Saul. And so there's this husband, and we'll call him Elimelech, and he marries this woman, and there's a famine in the land of Bethlehem. And so he decides that he's going to journey to the land of Moab because he hears that there's food there. And so he goes there, and when he goes there, he dies and leaves his wife Naomi with 2 boys. And as time goes on, over a 10-year period, those boys grow up, and they then take Moab wives, Ruth and Orpah. And then after another 10 years, her 2 sons die. And they haven't had any children with their wives. And so the mother, Naomi, is left in this situation, and she's actually quite bereaved in this situation. She's lost her husband. She's now lost her 2 sons, and she has no offspring or children or grandchildren. And she's in a pretty tough space. And then news reaches her that back in Bethlehem, back in the land of Israel, the famine is over and there is now food. And so Naomi decides that she's going to go back to Bethlehem, back to her people, back to this place where she's originally from. And she heads there. And she says to her now daughter-in-laws that are widows, "You don't have to come with me. You can go back to your own family and you can stay with your family." But Ruth says, "No. I want your people to be my people. I want your God to be my God." You see, Naomi had made such an impact on Ruth that she understood some things about this God that her and her husband, Naomi and her husband, served. And she wanted to stay with Naomi. Now the other widow of one of her sons, she decides, "No, I'm going to go back to my own family." And they weep, they cry, they have a big hug, and she goes back. But Naomi and Ruth, they head back to Bethlehem. And as they arrive in Bethlehem, they are broke, but they do have Dad's land. And so they go back and they take possession of that. And then we see this redemption piece that begins to happen underneath the customs and rules of Israel at the time. This man named Boaz comes into the scene. And Ruth is out minding her own business, doing the things that she's supposed to do to gather food. And so she's gleaning after the harvest. And so back in those times, what was done for the poor is the poor were allowed to go out and glean from the fields of those places that have been harvested. And as Ruth is gleaning in the fields, she stumbles along this field of Boaz. And it's a relative of hers. Well, after a few little conversations back and forth, what ends up happening is Boaz marries Ruth. And they end up having children together, and they produce the father of King David. Now, this whole story is really a story of a family. But it also has a much bigger picture because it is a story of God's sovereignty. And how God is working through the lives of people, how He's working through tragedy, how He's working through the events in everyday life to bring about His will. Now, for some of us, this story may sound like something that is in the past. And yes, it is a real story. It's not some made-up story, but we can go back in history and we can see that these people are real people and existed, and there was famine during this time period. But it's a picture of any family. And one of the hardest lessons to learn in sort of family life is this lesson that both Ruth and Naomi had to learn. And that's sort of our first principle here, is that obedience doesn't guarantee blessing. You know, as a family, when we're gathering together as a family and we're following God, because remember, Naomi and her husband, when they're in Bethlehem, they're part of what God is doing. They're worshiping this God of the children, that all of the children of Israel are worshiping. And they are in desperate situation because there's famine, and then they get this idea that they're going to leave. Never thinking that their children are going to die, and the husband is going to die, and Naomi is going to be left a widow. And in fact, as we look at the text, she is in a very difficult place. When we read in Ruth chapter 1, verse 19, let me read some of this to you so you kind of hear and feel her anguish. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. So this is after they've sort of parted. They're coming back to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara," which actually means bitter. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Wow. Then she says this, "Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Lord has brought calamity upon me?" That doesn't sound like a happy mom. That actually sounds like a woman who is in deep distress in her heart. She's in this place where she's like, I'm just bitter. I'm totally resentful about going off to this place. I've not only lost my husband, but I've lost my sons. I have no wealth. I have nothing. I'm in this place where I don't have an inheritance. And she is in a very sad place. This calamity, this distress, this damage that has happened to her, she did not ask for. And the whole town, the whole village of Bethlehem, wow. Talk about being centered out in a small town. I guarantee you, around the well, everybody's talking about, did you hear Naomi's back? Did you hear what happened to her? And all she has been the whole time is obedient. In fact, what we see in Naomi is we just see this woman who has been incredibly faithful to God. She's in this great distress, even because of what God has allowed to happen to her. But she still is calling him the Almighty. You see, when we live for God and for Jesus, things don't always go well. So what happens in your life when things are not going well? When things, maybe the thing that you're doing is not blessed as much as it maybe has in the past. Or you feel that God has called you to go in this certain direction, or He's leading you in this direction, and all of a sudden it's not turning out the way that you thought it would. You see, sometimes the gospel, the good news of Jesus is presented as, come to Jesus and all your problems will be solved. But that's not what we see with Naomi and Ruth here. For some of us, we have gone through some very difficult times, maybe similar to Naomi and Ruth, the loss of a loved one. For others of us, it has come in different ways. Maybe it's a loss of a job. Maybe it's just hard. Life is hard. Nothing ever seems to go right. And when life is hard, all that we can really see is what is around us. And as Christians, as people who love the Lord and Jesus and want to follow God, we need to find this balance between being obedient and suffering. And being able to be okay that we're living in this space. You see, when life is hard, we need to stop focusing on what is immediately around us, but to actually start looking for God and remember that the story isn't finished yet. You know, when I look at this story, you know, we get the perspective of seeing everything from seeing the beginning to the end. We know that there's going to be a marriage. We know that there is going to be this baby that's going to come who's Obed, and he's going to be the father of David, and David's going to be one of the great kings of Israel and lead the people Israel. But it's also this picture, this line that's going to lead to Jesus. We know the big story. We're coming at a point in history where we see everything. But Naomi wasn't. When Naomi and Ruth are traveling from Bethlehem all the way back, from the land of Moab to Bethlehem, they don't see the big picture. All they see and feel is their circumstance that they're in, which is terrible. And many of us have the same thing. Thank you. Many of us have the same thing happening in our life, where things aren't maybe going that well and we can't see the future. We can't see how the things that are happening now are actually going to work out for our good in the end and going to lead to something better. And we get stuck, and we become just like Naomi and Ruth. Naomi so much so that she's just bitter, resentful about the whole thing. And the lesson that we learn here from Naomi and for Ruth is that we just don't give up. We just don't give up in those places. Because the tendency for all of us is when we're thinking, you know what, I've been obedient, and this is how these things should work out. And then when they don't, for some of us, we just go, that's it, I'm bitter, I'm done with this, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm leaving this behind, and I'm going to go and try something else. But that's not what Naomi and Ruth did, even in the midst of the embarrassment of everybody pointing the finger at Naomi, who went away full and now has come back empty. Here's the thing that we need to remember. God is still doing something. We can't forget this. In the midst of our obedience, when we're not feeling blessed, when we're not feeling like the things are going the way that we thought that they should go, God is still doing something. I may not know, you may not know exactly what it is, but He's still doing something. He's still working together that situation, and He has a purpose for that situation that you're in. And for us in those moments, we need to look past the discouragement. When things don't go well, and even in our difficulties, God is still in control. And God is still working things together for our good. And this is really a seasoning, a maturing time in our faith. And as we look at Ruth and Naomi, we see them go through this period. We get the sort of bird's eye view of it where we see from the beginning to the end. But we can't see that in our lives. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But this we do know. God's promise is this, the same that it was to Naomi and Ruth as it is to us, is that He's right there with us. And we continue to stay right with Him. Because there's something amazing about to happen. And I want to sort of open up our hearts and open up our minds to think differently about our life when we are in these places. When we are feeling discouraged, when we are feeling like, I don't like the way that this is playing out. Because God begins to show up in these situations. And here's the second thing we're learning this morning from Ruth and Naomi, is that we need to trust God for these divine appointments. You see, when God is in control, when God is sovereign over everything, and He knows the beginning from the end from the beginning, and He sees the whole story, the whole journey of your life, your family, your grandkids that aren't even born yet, He is still working. He is bringing divine appointments into your life. Now, what do I mean by a divine appointment? Well, divine appointment is this just random event that happens where God just shows up. And we actually see this in this story of Ruth and Naomi, this account of their life. And I want to point these phrases out to you because you just might miss them. They're so in the text, they're just kind of like, yes, on and on it goes. So in Ruth chapter 2, verse 3, listen to this. It says, "And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, after him in whose sight I shall find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.'" That sounds pretty innocent. An innocent conversation. But she just happened to come on this field, as it says in verse 3. "So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field that belonged to Boaz." Have you ever had that moment where you're kind of maybe thinking about someone and maybe praying for them, and you head off to the grocery store and you're bumping into them in the grocery store? That's a divine appointment. You weren't really necessarily planning it, but the circumstances of the day and how God was sovereignly in control of this other person, and you end up at the grocery store at the same time. Now, for some of us, we might just say, well, that's just a coincidence. But have you ever realized that God is sovereign over everything that you do and over everything that everybody does? Now, this is hard for us to understand because when we're talking about God being in control of the events around us, and we say, well, wait a second, I've got free choice. Yes, you have free choice. But God actually knows what you will choose. So here we have this moment in time where Ruth is just going about the thing that she needs to do, which is gleaning, because she's in this poor category now. And she just randomly happens to come across this field of Boaz. And remember, there's not just one field of Boaz. There's like hundreds of fields that the harvest is being harvested in. And the poor, there are many poor that are traveling around and going out around these places, and they're gleaning from these owners that own these fields. There has just been a famine in the land. Everybody is desperate. But as it happens, she comes to this field of Boaz. Now, Boaz is a relative of hers. She doesn't know this in the beginning. Remember, she's a Moabitess from another country. But she soon learns about this as she's talking to Naomi. Now, as time comes about, she then presents himself to Boaz, and Boaz says, hey, I'm not your closest redeemer. There is another redeemer. Maybe he will redeem you. And this, again, without going into too much cultural context, there's a lot being said right here, but they had this whole protocol about if your spouse died, then someone within the family would come and marry that spouse to continue the family line. Not necessarily having that kind of tradition today, but that's the tradition of the time. And so he's like, hey, there's someone who's closer to you than I am, who can redeem you, who can be a spouse for you. Let me go talk to him. And I find this interesting too, because here's this other moment of a divine appointment. And we read about it too, again, in chapter 4, verse 1. And again, the language, you kind of just don't even notice it as you read. And it says in verse 1, now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. It just so happened. He just showed up. Now, for all of us, we kind of think, well, is that just another coincidence? And we might even write some of this stuff off as coincidences as we're living out our life every day. But what we see here is that we actually see some divine appointments in the life of Ruth and Naomi that are bigger than Ruth and Naomi. And we see God acting through this close kinsman redeemer and Boaz, even when Naomi and Ruth aren't there. Now this idea for you this morning of a divine appointment, this might be a brand new thought for you. You've never even thought about divine appointments before. On the other hand, you might be here this morning and you're like, yeah, I know these divine appointments. I've seen these divine appointments show up in my life. We need to trust God for these divine appointments because they show up all the time if we're looking for them. You see, and this is the encouraging part about Ruth and Naomi. Because as we sort of look at this story, what we start to see as these divine appointments start to happen is the attitude changes. She's not like, oh, I'm so bitter. Oh, God's not finished with me yet. And that's so important when we're feeling in this place of discouragement because we just don't think things are going the way that they should. Because God sets up these divine appointments. Now, how do they show up in our lives? Well, we may not recognize them, but here's some things to look for. Divine appointments show up when we're meeting people. God sends someone across your path that you may need to help, or maybe there to encourage you. God sometimes shows up in the divine appointment of jobs out of the blue. You weren't expecting it, you weren't looking for it, and all of a sudden, boom, God put something in front of you that you didn't even see. House purchases, your spouse, how you met your spouse, those divine appointments. You see, part of walking by faith with God is seeing that God does bring divine appointments into our life. And when things are difficult, when we're being obedient and the blessing doesn't seem to be there and we're discouraged, then we need to trust that God is going to use divine appointments in our life. And faithful believers will watch for these moments as God is directing our life. So let me ask you this question. Can you think of a time when there was a divine appointment in your life? That God just sovereignly, out of the blue, did something and just went boom. Looks like a coincidence. Looks like something almost ordinary, but yet it's extraordinary. Because that's what divine appointments are. Where God is just moving throughout the course of this world, bringing about His will. And your story, from the beginning to the end of your story, is full of divine appointments. Divine appointments can be even so simple as a Sunday school teacher. Divine appointments can be so simple as a mentor that comes into your life at the right time to help you through the right thing. You see, divine appointments show up all the time. And where the error is that we don't actually give credit to the divine for those appointments. And some of us are actually really good at taking those divine appointments and saying, well, I did this. I did all of these things that brought me to this place. Like Ruth easily could have said, well, I went out to the richest man's field and gleaned there. Boaz could have said, I went to the near kinsman's redeemer's house. I did that. But that's not how we see it playing out in this passage of Scripture, and it's definitely not how it plays out in real life. Divine appointments are those moments, and let me clarify this too, it's not chance. It's not luck. It's God divinely moving in your life and in the life of the people around you. Now, what does this actually look like? Because we're seeing this transition. We're seeing Naomi. She leaves full. She goes off to the land of Moab. She loses her sons. She loses her husband. She comes back to Bethlehem in this empty place. She then has to trust God. There's nothing left to do. And God divinely begins to move and orchestrate and flow this tapestry of events through her life. And then all of a sudden, we get this new picture, this new thing, this new life that arrives. Now, this is another principle that we learn. And I think there's a growing that's happening in Naomi and Ruth as we follow this along. And remember, this is taking years to do. We've trying to reduce it down to like 10, 15 minutes. But what happens is that there's new life springing up. It arrives amid providence. Now, this word providence, which is our third point this morning, that new life arrives during providence. And for some of us, we don't necessarily use the word providence. It's actually an old English kind of term that things are providence, like Anne of Green Gables kind of time period that would use this word providence. But providence, as it's understood scripturally, speaks to something different than God's sovereignty. And I want to explain this to us this morning, because this is important for us to understand how God works in our lives today. So God's sovereignty, and this is a definition from John Piper. I think he's probably one of the best scholars in this area. He says, God's sovereignty is God's right and power to do all that he decides to do. So think of that. God, he has the right and he has the power to do all that he decides to do. Now, God's providence is different. That's God seeing to everything working out according to what he decides. So what that means is absolutely everything that needs to be done to bring about his purposes, God sees that it happens. So God's sovereignty is this sort of big overarching umbrella over all the events in the world that God is deciding to do. His providence is this thing that's underneath his umbrella where he's just working through all of the events, bringing about, seeing to everything that needs to be in place. Now, when you think about that, that's kind of like, wow. And I always think about this when I'm driving down the road and I come upon somebody that has been pulled over by the police and they're getting a speeding ticket. When 15 minutes earlier, I was behind a slow vehicle and I was getting frustrated. And I'm like, God, thank you for your providence. Thank you for your providence where I am able to be behind a slow vehicle and not end up being the one that's pulled over at the side of the road with the police cruiser. That's an illustration of God's providence where he's seeing and orchestrating and tapestrying all of these things together so that he gets us where we need to be. Now, I will also admit that sometimes that is me at the side of the road with the police officer behind me, and I'm realizing, yes, you allowed that to happen for me to remind me that I need to keep my foot soft on the pedal. Now, sometimes we just go through life not really thinking about God's providence in everyday life. We're so consumed with ourselves that we're forgetting that God himself is seeing to everything that's happening in your life. He is overshadowing, he's not desiring, but he's allowing even the difficult, evil stuff that comes into your life and my life. And that is really hard for us to wrap our heads around. But when we start to walk by faith at the level that Naomi and Ruth are walking at, where they've gone through the difficult times and they're still holding on to God, they're still trusting God, they start to see these divine appointments. And then they start to see providence in their life, where God is making things right, where he's bringing new life. We know the scripture verse in Romans. It says, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. I'll say that again. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. The Apostle Paul wrote that for us. He wrote it to the church. He wrote it to you. He wrote it to me. Those words are not some catchphrase. They're not some flippant answer to the difficulties. But they are words that are true. And Naomi and Ruth's story actually point to that. They point to the fact that all things, even though it has really sucked losing a husband and 2 children, the travel, the journey, the unknowing what is going to happen next, how are we going to make it, all of that begins to look better when all of a sudden Boaz, who is this redeemer, decides that he's going to marry Ruth. They have a child. And now all of a sudden Naomi's life has meaning. all of the pain, all of the suffering, it has meaning. This new life, this new baby ends up going on to be the father of David. And eventually through this, we see Jesus coming through the line of David. Now you don't know, and I don't know what is going to happen tomorrow, let alone 10 years from now, let alone 2 decades from now, or your children's children's children. But what God promises us, as He is sovereign, as He is this God of providence who is always seeing and making sure that everything happens according to how He wills and how He decides, then we can actually trust Him. Because this is the big lesson. This is the whole lesson of the book of Ruth. Is that Ruth and Naomi learned to trust God and have faith in God more than anything else. That's the big lesson. And as we glean from Ruth and Naomi, that needs to be our big takeaway too. We need to be able to trust God in His sovereignty, in His providence, in His divine appointments, in the midst of us being obedient and us suffering, that God is going to work all things together for our good. And we trust Him. And we put our faith in Him because that's who He is. And I think today, we need Ruth and Naomi's. And not just ladies that are Ruth and Naomi's, but men that are like Ruth and Naomi. Who are trusting God. Hanging on to the faith that God has called us to hang on to. Looking for these divine appointments. Even when we can't see the bigger picture. Because God's working out His providence in our lives. Now, in the midst of all of this, Ruth and Naomi don't know that there's a Messiah coming from the lineage, from the mess of their circumstances. And I want to encourage all of us this morning. We don't know if we're in a current mess, how God is going to use that mess generations down the road. God is faithful to do what He has decided to do. And the real Redeemer that Ruth and Naomi needed was not Boaz, but was Jesus. And it was because, and this is what's so important when we see the bigger story, the meta narrative that's flowing from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. What we see here, and this is why the story of Ruth is in the Old Testament, by the way, because God needed to let us know that He is continually working out His bigger picture. And so the meta-narrative here is that the picture of the Redeemer, which is Boaz, is really Jesus, the Messiah that has come to redeem all of creation. And that's a wonderful picture here. And you and I don't know what God has in the future that we need to be involved with today. And sometimes the things that we're involved with today seem difficult, seem hard, seem overwhelming. But that new life is coming. It is coming because God Himself has said it will. So this morning, as we think about the ladies in our midst, Ruth and Naomi, God has something in every situation that you're in. He's working something out that is good, that is according to His will. For you, for me, wherever we are in our story, we just need to trust Him. Look for those divine appointments. Look for those moments that the hand of providence, God seeing everything according to His will, that He will do what He said He would do. And for some of us, that just means that we're reaffirming that what He started, He will finish. And that actually takes surrender. I'm struck by Ruth and Naomi's growth through this period of time. As they grow and understand, and as they trust, and they get to this beautiful place, this beautiful picture at the end. May we be in that place too.